Welcome, everyone. We'll just give it 30 seconds here while everyone gets into the webinar. Great. So welcome, everyone, to the launch of the Good Practice Review 8, Humanitarian Security Risk Management. My name is Mariah Jo, and I'm from Humanitarian Outcomes. We would like to thank Tara at the Collective Security Group for managing this Zoom webinar for us. It is great to see so many people here today. A few housekeeping items as we wait for everyone to join. Closed captioning should be available, and there is a link in the chat with directions on how to turn them on from your side. This webinar is being recorded, and the video will be available after on HPN's and Humanitarian Outcomes' websites. We will be using the chat function throughout the event to share relevant links and resources, so please keep an eye on it. Due to the size of the group today, we will be utilizing the Zoom integrated Q&A function, and we will be addressing all questions and comments during the Q&A section at the end. During the presentations, please feel free to enter questions in that format, and we will pose them to our contributors at the end. If you see a question in the Q&A you'd like answered, you can upvote it with the thumbs up button so that we can be able to address the most popular topics first. The program of today's event includes an introduction of the GPR8, an example of how it has been used in a humanitarian context, what's new in this third edition, followed by 2 panels on staff care and combat related to humanitarian action. Before the Q&A section at the end, we will also share where to access this new edition and the new interactive microsite. Without further ado, I will now hand it over to Abby Stoddard from Humanitarian Outcomes.
Well, thanks everyone for being here, and thank you, MJ, for hosting. We have a pretty packed program today, so I'll be as quick as possible, but I do want to take a moment here at the top to express my enormous gratitude to all of the practitioner experts who have contributed to this revision, several of whom will be speaking today, and to our publishing partner, HPM, our research partner, GISF, and of course to my humanitarian outcomes colleagues who have worked on this project to varying degrees, particularly MJ, Monica, and Mariana. But most of all, I want to thank Adelicia Fairbanks. She's our lead editor, and she not only beautifully coordinated all of the moving parts, but was a key contributor herself to the volume. On a kind of a sad note, this third revision was championed and funded from the very beginning by former colleagues at USAID, before the agency was effectively obliterated back in February. Now, the loss of funding at the kind of final stretch of this project was a serious setback. But it makes me even more grateful that we're here today with a finished product. So the launch is taking place in a very different security environment than we started 3 years ago, even than 6 months ago in a way. We're looking at a rapidly changing, perhaps in some ways disintegrating global order, and the humanitarian sector in which security risk management came to be as a field is now, I think it's fair to say, crippled. But even if what emerges is a very reduced and under-resourced sector, and maybe some of the more sophisticated and resource-intensive aspects of SRM, as described in this book, become less feasible, I feel strongly that the core content will remain useful and relevant. So there are operational principles that support security for humanitarian aid providers, and that these principles can be implemented with teachable skills. So I'm going to now pass it to 3 people who can give a backdrop to our discussions today. First will be Michael O'Neill of O'Neill Paragon Solutions, longtime security risk management professional and one of the midwives of the original GPR8. And then after Michael, we'll hear from Sean Bickley, another senior SRM expert speaking on behalf of GISF. And finally, we're happy to welcome Serena Abi-Khalil of the Humanitarian Practice Network, our publisher and the institution that originated the Good Practice Review series. So Michael, please take it away.
Thanks, Abby. I want to reiterate my appreciation for everybody that contributed to this edition of GPR8. This is a labor of love for so many of us, going back to 1998 when the first USAID OFDA training was initiated. At that time, there were 2 trainings, one each with 25 participants, one in Florida and one in the UK. And the one in Florida had 16 agencies and 7 nationalities represented, while the UK training was 22 agencies and 11 nationalities. These trainings and the curriculum in these trainings became the basis of the initial GPR8, with Conrad von Brabant being the academic and record keeper and ultimately the titular author of the initial GPR8. It's interesting that the principles that advise the training, the number one principle was based on relationships. And I think this is really important, that we get caught up in the SOPs and contingency plans and structures. But when we look at the initial thought process behind developing an NGO-specific security risk management approach, relationships was number one. It's relationships between the security office and their program people, between organizations and governments, stakeholders of various kinds. Establishing those relationships contribute not only to the facilitation of the work that we're trying to do, but it also allows us to gain insight into the context and the issues that feed the analysis on which we base our decision making. Another principle was that one size is not going to fit all, and every agency and every context is going to need its own analysis and look at its particular vulnerabilities in order to come up with an effective security risk management plan. Which leads me to the next principle, which is analysis informing decision making, and having the skills on the ground to develop an analytical framework from which to make informed decisions. The next principle was being multidisciplinary. This is, security risk management is in and of itself interdisciplinary, but also contributes to the effective management and program delivery and support for staff within the humanitarian context. The final point was to contextualize the entire process through a defined security strategy within the organization that sets out the parameters of what is appropriate and not appropriate within a specific context. So based on that, these trainings were conducted. They went for 5 days, and they were initiated largely based on the review of our experiences as humanitarian workers, mostly in Kosovo, Chechnya, and in Congo, with the support for those people fleeing the genocide in Rwanda. And the general consensus at that time is we need to do better. We can't be coming into security risk management with an attitude that we can figure it out as we go along. And there's so many people that contributed to the initial development of GPR8, some of whom are still around, Sean, and that it's been an iterative process. And this is what's important, is that the process is based on, and the subsequent revisions, one in 2010 and now this one in 25, have been driven by organizations and institutions that have emerged since 1998. The Security Advisory Group of Interaction evolved from this working group that conducted the training. Subsequently, we have the European Interagency Security Forum, which is now the Global Interagency Security Forum, the representation of NGOs at OSAC, the involvement of humanitarian outcomes and insecurity insights. All of these institutions have given us venues and organizations that we can turn to and rely on to conduct constant research, develop resources, and create a community for us to continue to exchange information. And finally, going back to what Abby said, we're in a dynamic environment. We've always been in a dynamic environment. Our organizations change, the environment changed, the conditions under which we are trying to administer programs where we need security risk management have changed. So there's 3 things that really need to be focused on here, and that continue to be focused on GPR8. One is that it's an iterative process. It's constantly changing. We need to use our own principles of analysis to inform our decision making. The second is it's dynamic. It's not going to change. Our organizations change, the funding environment changes, the response environment changes, the conditions of the people we're serving changes. So we need to be flexible and adaptable in order to be effective in our work. And finally, it's inclusivity. And as much as inclusivity gets a bad rap these days, we can see in our work that the broader the inclusion, the better the management. You'll see in the new revision of GPR8, the evolution of our understanding of why it's important to bring all the different voices into the conversation in order to have a fuller understanding of what the issues are and how best to effectively manage security risks. That's sort of how we got to where we are today. And I'll hand over to Sean to carry the narrative forward. Sean, over to you.
Thank you, Michael. Also, thank you, Abby and Humanitarian Outcomes team for inviting GISF to, say a few words at the beginning of this launch. Like Michael, as somebody who was around in the NGO security world at the time when GPR8 first came out, it was clearly a sort of seminal piece of work at that time. It drew together much of the early thinking about security approaches that were sort of permeating in the sector. And it was, I still have my original copy here. It was very much the sort of go-to resource, the sort of that where at the time it was a very fledgling security risk management community. There was very little guidance. There was very little documentation about how to do security management, what security management, risk management involved. So this was the go-to resource for that. It also introduced a lot of the core concepts and principles that we now today are just standard within the NGO security approach. It was one of the first publications to recognize that security wasn't just about protecting staff. It was also about enabling humanitarian access and also about maintaining program continuity. So it drove a lot of those core principles that are now really have shaped the approach across the sector and also have helped shape the security policies and SRM practices of hundreds of organizations throughout the years. It also provided a common security language, which has helped standardized approaches, therefore enabling greater interagency coordination and collaboration. And it carved the way for as Michael just mentioned, it carved the path for networks like GISF to emerge, and also for mechanisms like SLT, Saving Lives Together. As with the previous editions, creating a publication like GPR8, as a result of combined efforts, it involved various contributors and practitioners as well. And GISF is very proud to have been involved and supported the I'm getting my name muddled up here, GPR8 update, and also worked closely with Humanitarian Outcomes on the State of Practice report, which was published in 2004, which involved research in 5 key humanitarian contexts: CAR, Colombia, Ethiopia, Iraq, and Ukraine. And the findings from that research and that report also helped focus the content of this updated volume of GPR8. The GISF team also provided direct support in reviewing drafts of the publication. And we were also really pleased to see that a lot of the areas that GISF has been championing over the past few years, such as inclusive security, person-centered approaches, and also equitable security partnerships, are now fully embedded in this new version of GPR8, which is great to see. Finally, a lot has changed, has been mentioned, in terms of the sector and in terms of not only the scale and the nature of risks that aid workers face, but also in terms of the approaches that NGOs take in how they manage security risks. And one of the enduring sort of reputations and relevance of GPR8 has been its ability to capture those essential principles and practices in humanitarian security risk management, and also provide the strategic thinking and guidance for dealing with some of the most current operational security, access, and duty of care challenges confronting the sector. So it's great to see that this new version continues that legacy. Okay, so over to you, Serena.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you, everyone. The Humanitarian Practice Network is really pleased to see this review and this edition being finally launched after a collective work. especially that HPN has been the host since the first version, as mentioned by Abby, and historically till date, the most downloaded publication on the network, which speaks volumes on the added value of this type of work as well. As mentioned before, this review launching is at the same time happening with we're facing a lot of local and national workers at risk in different emergency hubs in a level that hasn't been seen or recorded before, unfortunately, which speaks volumes on the need to not just change in the way we operate, adopt practices and principles and reflect on them, but also on how we share knowledge on these changes and on these different adaptations. The Humanitarian Practice Network has also embarked on a new journey to transform the network into not just a publication house for practitioners, but also to a partnership-led network that ensures representation from emergency hubs and ensures that the voices of local practitioners are being participatory and owners of what is being shared in terms of practices, experiences, and skills. So we are looking forward as well to see how we can link the work and the outcomes of this review to the work of local practitioners, and also how to see it being linked to practice and learning and knowledge sharing, based also on South-South sharing and also on global sharing of people in the sector. I'll hand it over to Abby for now. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, everybody, for that section. Abby, Michael, Sean, Serena. Just a quick note, we're trying to get the Q&A working here. I'm sorry, the chat working, but in the meantime, the links will be either posted in the Q&A. If we get the chat working, that's where they'll be. So now it is my pleasure to introduce Awal Bihi from CARE International in Sudan. Awal contributed extensively to numerous chapters of the GPR8 and has been an incredible resource for the GPR8 team. Awal?
Thank you so much, MJ. And I'm really happy to share to start with sharing my experience with the GPR8 book, which I'm going to show the audience. This is the book. This is the older version, which I kept it. As you see, this book was overused by me. That's why it looks like an old and kind of worn out, but it's okay. I got this book sometime in December 2011, at the time when security risk management literature was somehow limited. Of course, there were a lot of organizations that had some level of SRM policies and guidelines, but this handbook really served as an additional resource, and it did help a lot of organizations to develop their own internal SRM policy and guidelines. I still remember how this GPR8 book helped me back in the days when I was in Somalia. For instance, when I was asked to carry out a security risk assessment in the field, I would just pick my GPR8 and go to chapter 2 on risk assessment, to get some insights on how to conduct security risk assessment. When I needed to talk about the NGO's security management strategies during staff training, I would just go back to the book and delve into chapter 3, which talks about acceptance, protection, deterrence, and so on. Again, when we had staff members kidnapped back in Somalia, I would consult with chapter 5 on critical incident management and chapter 14, which talks about hostage and kidnap situations and so on and so forth. Honestly speaking, I can say this book became one of my best friends for so many years, and I really kept it very well. But over the years, I have to say that the relevance of the GPR8 started to decline sometime in 2018, 2019. And this was mainly because of change in security risk management approach and practices within the industry at the time, especially a time when additional resources were published by GISF and Humanitarian Outcomes and some other organizations. Just to mention but few, there was this Security to Go, the risk management toolkit, which I think the last edition was published in 2020, which was quite helpful. Shuan was mentioning, we had the state of SRM report, state of SRM practice report, which was published in 2024 by GISF on humanitarian outcomes, which really evaluated the status of SRM practices within the industry and presented some recommendations moving forward. Again, more recently, there was another publication, another resource called SRM Strategy and Policy Development Handbook, which was published by GISF in collaboration with IELTS sometime in 2024, which is quite interesting, especially when it comes to development of policies and strategies and frameworks and so on. That being said, I have to admit that the GPR8 book is a very unique security handbook because of the volume of the topics discussed and the level of details, as well as the approach and the methodology, which really reflected a kind of collective efforts by so many stakeholders, drawing on the experience and expertise of so many security management professionals and humanitarian aid workers from across the world. Just to conclude, I just want to say, unfortunately, as everybody knows, we are living in a crazy world where the risk landscape is worsening every day. Therefore, humanitarian risk management practices will definitely continue to evolve, to enable organizations adapt to the changing environment. And I believe that the new GPR8 book, which we are launching now, is part of the solutions we are looking for to address the risks and the challenges we face every day. But of course, we'll have to keep on exploring more solutions in the face of increasing risks and threats in many countries where humanitarian aid work is carried out. My wish is that the GPR8 book is not just a book, but a journey. It's a living document that will need to be updated from time to time, to capture good SRM practices within the industry. And I hope that HPN, GISF, and humanitarian outcomes will be able to continue to advocate for more funding to keep this book alive and to publish more resources and guidelines that will capture the next paradigm shifts in SRM practices. I think I'll stop here. Thank you so much, and back to you, MJ.
Thank you again, Owl, for your presentation and everything you contributed to the edition. The team really appreciates it. So next up is Adelicia Fairbanks, the lead editor, to discuss the GPR8 and what is new in this edition. Adelicia.
Hello, everyone. I see a lot of familiar names, a lot of whom contributed to this edition, and I just wanted to say a thank you to everyone who gave their time and resources and did it out of the goodness of their hearts. It definitely, this edition would not be possible without you. I'm going to very briefly be talking about what's new in this third edition. So what we initially did was updated all the content of the previous edition's chapters. We were very conscious of the fact that since 2010, there are a lot of new resources in the sector, a lot of them from GISF, and we didn't want to replicate what already exists. So the idea was for this new edition to not be a how-to guide, but more to talk about the principles, talk about good practice considerations and discussions. And that is why at the end of every chapter, there is a further resources section where you can find additional resources, how-to guides that exist on that particular topic. What else is new? As was mentioned earlier, we have a new chapter in the new book around the person-centered approach, what that means in practice, how it can be utilized in different scenarios, what it is. And we have endeavored to have examples of what that means throughout the book in different sections. So hopefully that will be useful. We also try to make sure that this new edition had broader relevance. So even though it is primarily for security staff, we wanted also to have it be useful for people who are new to security risk management. So anyone who's coming new to the field, managers who might not know very much, students who'd like to learn more. We also try to be more inclusive of local aid organizations and the realities faced by local aid workers as well. And related to that, now we also have a new chapter on international and local partnerships. We also tried to broaden the scope of the edition, which is now why it doesn't have the word operational anymore in the title, is that we've also looked now at non-operational aspects of security risk management. So we delved a bit further into key principles, what duty of care means, governance structures, monitoring, even funding. We have a new chapter on funding as well. And we also expanded the focus on people. Relationships, like Michael was saying at the beginning, are very important. A lot of that is about empowering staff to make sound security decisions. So now we have a dedicated chapter on security training. We have a chapter on how to communicate around security issues. We have a chapter on staff care and also another one on medical considerations. Other new chapters that we have are related to specific risks. Probably not surprising to anyone, we have a new chapter on digital security, which also looks at mis, dis, and malinformation. We have a new chapter on criminality. We have a new chapter on hostile surveillance. We look also at the implications of security for advocacy work and how advocacy can support security as well. And we also have a new chapter looking at access and deconfliction and how that works within, how that interrelates with security risk management. If you want to go to the next slide, I will introduce the first panel. So we are really happy. I personally am very happy that this new edition has a dedicated chapter on staff care, looking at resilience and mental health and psychosocial support for staff who've gone through a security incident. The first person will be Lisa, who is a veteran here in security risk management, the former head of GISF and now a mental and physical well-being consultant. Marieke will also be presenting in this panel. She was the primary author of this new chapter. And then Steve Dennis will also be speaking from his experience working on a lot of duty of care cases and bringing in new examples of what actually staff care means in practice. So I will hand over to Lisa to kickstart the panel.
Thank you, Adelicia. Not entirely sure I like the term veteran, but I will accept it. I am really excited to be here to see the launch of the new GPR8 and thrilled that this version contains a section on staff care, as Adelicia said. So why is this important to me? When I came back from my last full-time overseas mission in 2009, I was pretty much broken. Fortunately, my organisation sent me for therapy, which started my mental health journey to where I am now as a practicing psychotherapist. In this time, while working with GISF for better security risk management in the humanitarian and aid sector, it became more and more apparent to me that you cannot separate physical and mental safety and security. So again, why? From a personal security perspective, if we consider Maslow's hierarchy of needs, after food, water, and shelter, security is the next basic human need. So for the mental well-being of all staff, effective security is essential. And if we consider security risk management, we know that despite all of the templates for risk assessments, crisis planning, etc., security risk management is as much an art as a science, depending on our ability to analyse the situation and make the right decision, whether that's on a day-to-day basis or responding to an incident. We also know that being stressed out impacts our decision-making ability. I mean, if you were abducted, would you want a member of the crisis management team suffering from burnout or PTSD? We also need to consider the mental well-being of those responsible for the security of others. Hearing about the threats and incidents that happen on a regular basis creates a real risk of vicarious or secondary trauma. Over the last few years, organisations have got better at considering staff well-being, particularly as part of crisis response and managing the threat of trauma. While this is great, it's not enough. As well as vicarious trauma and PTSD, humanitarians are also at risk of other mental health injuries, such as complex PTSD, burnout, compassion fatigue, and moral injury. This is not a sign of individual weakness. Organisations must take responsibility for their role in generating and maintaining the conditions that lead to these mental health injuries, including, but not limited to, toxic workplaces and long working hours. Responsibility cannot be abdicated by providing an employee assistance programme which puts all the onus on the individual to seek support. We can learn a lot about caring for mental health from the different cultures we work with. Many cultures have a community support-based approach, one that is not about stigmatizing the individual, but is around coming together to support each other. I learned this many years ago when I was working in the Philippines. The team had suffered a traumatic event just before I joined them. I offered them a staff retreat with a professional expert to facilitate the processing of the trauma, but the team looked crestfallen, and when I asked why, they said, "We have talked about this enough. We just want to have some fun together as a team." So we went to the beach, and it was great. We know that prevention is better than response for physical threats. We need to apply the same logic for mental health threats. We need to look at organisational structures and management systems, thinking about how we can strengthen that sense of community. This is not a responsibility for the human resources team alone or the security team, but it must be a cross-cutting issue based on organisational culture and empathetic management. There is a project in the pipeline with Humanitarian Outcomes to map current good practice on team resilience and build open source material to help organisations build and support that team resilience approach. If you are interested in supporting or getting involved in this project, do get in touch with me or Humanitarian Outcomes. And on that note, I will hand over to Marieke, who will tell you more about what is in the new GPR8 chapter on staff care. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And also, I must say that I am just beyond excited that HPN and Humanitarian Outcomes have added this staff care chapter to that new edition of GPR8. Because to fulfill our mission, that of their organizations, we strive to enable safe access, and that means both physical and mental safety. And this staff care chapter covers the whole range from resilience and well-being to stress and trauma. So for those of you who feel that this is beyond your scope of work, it is not. You might be surprised how easy it is to incorporate mental health and psychosocial support into security risk management, actually. So this chapter helps you consider, I'd say, like a mental health risk management approach, treating mental health risks like you would security risks. So for most staff care management, whether at the resilience or at the trauma end of the spectrum, you don't need clinical skills. You don't need to be a licensed psychologist. You need a lot of the soft skills that we need in general SRM as well. So common sense, genuine care, and the commitment to put them on paper and make them into a process. So let me share just a few of the themes addressed in the chapter, and I will use Gaza as a recent and ongoing example. So one of the themes is to ensure that staff feel supported, and that can be as simple as a check-in message. So what we're doing with our staff in Gaza, but also the West Bank, like when there is that escalation, we just do simple Arabic check-in messages to say like, hey, how are you? What do you need? And then that range of support is from global coverage, like Lisa was saying, like an employee assistance provider, to local support. So having a global provider, but also locally vetted too. So for Gaza, for instance, we have 2 locally vetted Palestinian Arabic-speaking counselors who can engage with our staff. A large part of the chapter is also dedicated to a trauma-informed approach, so promoting safety, trust, peer support, and empowerment. And for Gaza, for instance, that means where people are so dedicated to the work and to just surviving, they have trouble sort of focusing on their own staff care. But what we have is, you know, one, like person A is checking in on person B. Person B has that peer support for person C, and we see that that helps people care for each other. Another section is on psychological first aid, specifically for our folks going into Gaza, recognizing for themselves, what are you getting into, but also how can you support staff? How is this about their needs and supporting them when you get into this environment? And then the last two things I'd like to mention on that side is that the chapter also speaks about supporting the supporter, so those who provide that direct care and support. And then what I would add to that is also supporting those who care. So for instance, at the start of the war on Gaza, we also had staff care sessions for our country teams in Iraq, in Egypt, in Lebanon, who all cared so deeply and were so felt so involved that it goes way beyond those directly involved into any incident. Another area that I want to mention, and I know that many usually shy away from, but that is also important, is insurance and benefits. And for those of you yawning at the idea, that is not a boring subject. It is critical because it is the key to access and eligibility for everyone involved. This is, you know, the time that we talk about experts is way beyond. This is about all staff, and how can we make this work for our partners too, right? So in the chapter, there's a vast range of short, medium, and long-term support measures that are incorporated. And with that, I want to highlight that long-term can mean long-term. Support doesn't stop when any incident management stops. And this can include professional psychosocial support, but a large part of this is also just these soft skills that I spoke about at the beginning. So one example is that we had a staff member that we evacuated from Gaza after the first weeks of the war, and when they were in Bangladesh, when they recently had the unrest going on there, you know, it's just the outreach. How are you doing? Are you okay? What can we do to support? Because some of that triggered memories and trauma from her time in Gaza. So I would encourage all of you to put your genuine care into a process. It's the common sense response, it's the decent actions, and then just embedded in a procedural approach that is consistently used to support your staff wherever they come from and wherever they work. And it doesn't matter whether your organization is large or small, we can all do this. And I can tell you from experience in my own organization, it makes a world of difference. So lastly, I want to make a plea to this risk management community, because all of you frequent flyers know, put on your own oxygen mask before helping others. We cannot take care of others if we don't take care of ourselves. So with that, I am thrilled to hand over to our final presenter on staff care, who's as passionate about this topic as anyone I've met, and that is Steve Dennis.
Thank you very much, Marika. Thank you for the invitation to be here and talk about this important topic. Every aid worker in a high-risk setting wonders, if something happens to me, will my organization have my back? Far too many times, the hard answer is commonly no. After things go wrong, after a kidnapping, a bombing, or other exposure to trauma, at that moment, that holds the opportunity to stop any further injury and start recovery. At that moment, the path to people's careers and lives depend on the appropriateness of staff care. MJ, next one here. I'd like to share with you a simple 2x2 matrix I use to describe aid worker clients I help navigate their recovery from complex and traumatic injury. On the horizontal axis, you see the organization's capacity to support and their responsiveness. It could be higher or lower. On the vertical, we have the individual's capacity to articulate their needs and act, again, high and low. What happens in each of these four spaces can inform us of the probabilities, whether somebody sues, whether they recover despite their own pessimism, they are lost, or they thrive, and their insights help build the future of their organization. Let's break this down a little bit and look at the top left quadrant, the trust-based recovery. This is where both the individual and the organization show up strong. The organization works with the person to understand what they need, not as a negotiation where proof of injury is challenged, but as a trusted collaboration, the best path to a successful recovery. The GPR8 calls this approach the survivor-centered approach. It's building trust early, it's involving the individual on their terms, it's ensuring flexible reintegration and supporting long-term healing. These people don't become my clients, they become valued, insightful leaders. I'd like to go to the next quadrant there. Thank you, MJ. The structured pushback, or this is the litigation zone. Here, the staff member may be clear and articulate, but the organization may be dismissive or slow. The GPR8 outlines this risk explicitly. The disconnect can come from long delays in acknowledging psychological injuries, requiring excessive documentation, or failing to disclose key incident findings. These are the cases that look to the courts for resolution, with much reputational, financial, and emotional costs. The bottom left quadrant, the compassionate systems quadrant, this is where the staff member is disoriented, lost, or frozen. They don't know what to ask for. They're too deep in the fog of their own injury. But the organization doesn't wait for them alone. There's a saying, doctors shouldn't work harder than patients, but I think the tail end of that sentence is important, unless the patient is incapacitated. This is where the organizations step up without being asked for that. The GPR8 describes this approach that fits this quadrant as the proactive support, continuing salary without delay during an uncertain period, helping complete forms, and leaning in where support where there is it's clearly the right thing to do, even if the documentation hasn't caught up with it. This is the proactive care, and this can be the difference between a path to healing and a path to staff loss. And finally, the quadrant we don't like to talk about, systemic neglect and drift. The person is lost, and the organization accepts the silence as a resolution. The GPR8's case example of failure aftercare fits here. Failures in aftercare fits here. Too many reports demanded, injuries questioned till the person gives up. The result, there's no structured learning afterwards, and the staff loss happens again and again. To the individual, feelings of institutional betrayal occur. Your most valued colleagues leave, and some take their own lives. If part of our security risk management is to protect staff lives and well-being, this quadrant really reflects the failure in that risk management. This model helps us visualize the benefits of good policy or the consequences of its absence. The next slide, please. Oh, sorry, there it is. Yeah. The GPR8 staff care chapters gives us this guidance. Following its guidance can help push the probabilities towards positive recovery, the organization's capacity higher, the individual's abilities to articulate and act higher. So my invitation is to ask you, is your organization's support at the higher or lower capacity to support somebody who is frozen, overwhelmed, or reeling from complex injury? And how can you move it higher? Also, do your staff themselves have the right knowledge, skills, and attitude to start their own recovery at a higher level of capacity? And how can this be moved higher? There are ways, absolutely, and I'm pleased that the GPR8's inclusion of staff care into security risk management guidance. There are too many parallels in the outcomes for it not to be considered together. Thank you very much, and I wish a successful launch. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone on that panel. It's great to see that added into this edition, and I see people agreeing with that in the chat. I'll hand it now back over to Abby for our next panel on access, deconfliction, and combat-related threats.
Thanks, MJ. So this next panel is on a set of issues that cut across a couple of different chapters in the GPR8, and I'm really happy to have this group of practitioners to speak on them, because we'll be getting both global perspectives and the context-specific insights from two major conflict settings. So first, we'll hear from Alan Mordam of Trocare, then Petro Babyak of Mercy Corps Ukraine, Alsonosi Adam, representing the Localization Coordination Council of the ERRs in Sudan, and finally, Jochen Rieg of NRC. Alan, please go ahead.
Hi, thanks. So, I suppose, like everybody else, I should probably show my version of the book that was handed down to me a few years back. Um, yeah, this isn't a nice aspect to discuss, but the last few years we have seen we see the complete, like, a large spectrum of conflict, from near peer conflicts to, you know, modern militaries engaged in what we would have classed as insurgencies. And when we look at near peer conflicts, we're looking at, obviously, at the high end of things, Ukraine, Russia, and possibly at the lower end of things, inside in Sudan, between the RSF and the Sudanese Armed Forces. And then when we look at the insurgency side of things, we're looking at very capable militaries engaged with non-state armed groups. And what we've seen clearly since October 23 is the levels that both sides will go to both hide from each other and to find and destroy. It's quite horrific. So it's something that, as security managers, we need to understand the specifics inside. And the problem for us is that, especially with near peer conflicts, it drives innovation, and it drives innovation in the military sector. And for us to stay somewhat aligned with that, books like this are really, really important for us. The spread and adaptation of drones across a lot of conflicts across the globe is far faster than we would have seen with previous changes in tactics. And that, that really concerns me, and it concerns other security managers. Can we change fast enough? Can we adapt to mitigate these? And that's one thing GPR8 tries definitely to do, and does very well, is to try modernize the mitigations to make sure that they're proactive and updated, and yeah, that we understand what's going on. That brings me on to my next point around mechanics of these conflicts. And again, GPR8 puts significant effort into explaining how how different militaries use different tactics, and it's important to understand these so that we can actually understand how to mitigate them. Ukraine will be discussed, obviously, at length by the next speaker, but drones is an obvious one, and the lessons that the humanitarian sector in general has learned, and how to stay and how to avoid them, is key. But it does help spread that those lessons. But again, they're all very modern contexts, and we still see older style events occurring, such as barrel bombing in Sudan, for instance, just to drive fear. And that's, one of those things that it's not something I expected to see when I look through it. But when I discuss it with some of my peer group, they'll highlight, oh yeah, this happened in X year in a certain conflict, and they're able to pull it back. So again, these manuals, they're continually updated, but there's lots of separate events in it, and there's lots of good examples to bring you down to ground level. One of the big things that's popped up in the last, when we talk about mechanics of these things of last number of years, is obviously the use of AI and how it's changed. Removing the human interface from a conflict is quite scary. We've definitely seen we've seen it in Russia-Ukraine conflict. We've seen it with the IDF and their use of lavender, and the concept of removing someone from a drone system very recently. So again, all these are, they're very concerning and worrying, and something that we as security practitioners need to stay ahead of. And I suppose my last point is always on visibility, and staying visible on a modern battlefield is something that we possibly don't do very well. And again, GPR8 does highlight the need for us to stay ahead of that. But modern militaries don't look down on a conflict the same way we do. Our logos, our flags, our lights, they don't identify us as any different from anyone else in the field. So it's really important that we use how they can see. So having the likes of IR reflective materials on our vehicles so that we stand out in a very specific way, and modernizing how our visibility is in these spectrums is really quite important. But that's all from me. Thanks, Abby.
Thanks, Alan. Petro, over to you.
Thank you, Abby. And thank you, Alan, for mentioning Ukraine. So it is an honor. First of all, I would like to say that it is an honor for me to speak here today at the presentation of the GPR8 Humanitarian Security Risk Management. And I would like to begin by extending my deepest gratitude to everyone who made this publication possible, to authors, editors, reviewers, and those who managed this complex process of collecting and articulating good practices in one comprehensive opus. But above all, I want to thank the humanitarians on the ground. It is their courage, decisions made under pressure, and often painful lessons learned through lived experience that allowed us to gather this knowledge and share it with wider audience. Today, I want to share with you a few insights from the work of Mercy Corps in Ukraine, where we are responding to the unique and ever-evolving set of security risks posed by a full-scale state-on-state war. And I will start with the confliction, or rather its absence. Following the Russian Federation's withdrawal from the humanitarian notification system back in 2020, INGO operations in Ukraine are now conducted without the safety net of formal deconfliction mechanisms. While some organizations still submit HNS notifications, no notifications are received, no assurances are given, and no recognition is offered. This creates critical exposure, particularly near frontline areas where humanitarian convoys have not only suffered from collateral impact, but in some cases have been directly targeted by the Russian side. It is important to underline that international NGOs in Ukraine operate exclusively in Ukrainian government-controlled territory. We have no access to areas under control of the Russian Federation, which further limits coordination and the potential for protection. This lack of the confliction leads directly to the next challenge I'd like to highlight, the visibility dilemma. In the absence of the confliction, deciding whether to operate under a high visibility or low visibility profile becomes a highly contextual, high-stakes choice. On one hand, visibility helps avoid tragic misidentification by Ukrainian forces and facilitates access at checkpoints or near frontline areas controlled by Ukrainian military. On the other hand, in areas within reach of Russian UAVs, surveillance or attack, logos may attract the attention of the operator, rendering our convoys or individual vehicles a target. First-person view FPV drones operators, many of whom have very poor understanding of IHL, international humanitarian law, and a short kill chain, have reportedly targeted civilian vehicles, cyclists, even ambulances. There were also registered cases of INGOs being directly targeted, as well as IAEA vehicle being targeted with a UAV as well. In this context, the most effective strategy may be to look as boring and unremarkable as possible, avoid exposed terrain, conceal parking areas, keep staff outside of vehicles, and carry out distributions in underground facilities when possible. The third point I want to share relates to the long-range aerial threats that define the current operational environment across much of Ukraine. Daily attacks involving combinations of cruise and ballistic missiles, repurposed anti-aircraft weapons, glide bombs, and increasingly sophisticated UAVs have reshaped how we think about prevention and mitigation. Mercy Corps now evaluates the geographic position of offices, warehouses, and guest houses, not only for proximity to front lines, but for proximity to potential military or symbolic targets and known air defense deployments. We rely on local authorities and media threat alerts and monitor change in the long-range strikes tactics. Example, The Iranian-made Shahed 136, rebranded as Gerain and mass-produced by the Russian Federation, used to fly at low altitudes, vulnerable to mobile fire units with truck-mounted guns. This was a cost-effective defense for some time. But now these drones ascend to 2-3 kilometers where mobile fire units cannot reach them and descend only inside city limits, forcing air defense systems to intercept them at the cost of urban damage. Another example, Mercy Corps was among the first NGOs in Ukraine to trial frequency scanners to detect first-person view drones. These tools provided a tactical edge, helping our teams to take shelter. But as technology evolved, so did the threats. Fiber optic FPVs now bypass frequency detection entirely. We are still waiting for the technical means to address this threat. As for the FPV UAVs, with the growing range of these platforms, areas once considered relatively safe are no longer so. This demands constant adaptation, new monitoring solutions, and proactive scenario planning. Dear colleagues, every context brings its own challenges. Ukraine is a case where conventional, hybrid, and asymmetrical warfare tactics intersect, and humanitarian actors are operating in the crosshairs of it all. So I want to wish you all a boring and uneventful future in your professional life, because in our profession, that is the very definition of success. I thank you, and I would like to hand over to Adam Alsanossi now.
Hi. Hello, Sean. I hope you guys can hear me. I did not attend the mic check. Thank you. My name is Sonosi Adam, with the emergency response rooms of Sudan, and I'm sorry, I don't think I have an elegant methodology when it comes to the safety and security of the volunteers on the ground. We do plenty of services on the ground to our volunteers, but there's a limit to how successful we could be in actually saving people's lives on the ground, whether it's our own volunteers or the civilians at large. Through the years, we have done a couple of successful evacuations. In some cases, we evacuated an entire neighborhoods. We have also smuggled in food to neighborhoods and areas under siege. We have also moved comms from areas to areas for areas that the infrastructure has been not destroyed, but we do so, knowing the risks that the volunteers are going through, and our number one policy and methodology is don't fall on the hand of the belligerents, because if that happens, it's hard now to kind of get people out. We don't have similar tools like NGOs to negotiate the release of their volunteers or their staff. What we do is we try to engage local communities in this negotiation, but usually they don't succeed. And our second method is to evacuate people when their life is in danger. And all this works when we have responsive and agile partners that are supporting in this in the protection. Through the years, there's been very successful operations, but we also lost people as well due to the lack of responsiveness, or maybe just the delayed response. When you don't respond in time, usually the consequences are huge. Yeah, and we, within the emergency response rooms, we have the protection unit. And again, yes, we do lack a lot of experience in terms of doing safety and security. We call it protection just because we also operate in an environment. If we called an office security and safety, it actually will kind of attract more targeting from the belligerents than safety than protection units. So the protection units, they do work like with the emergency response rooms, and they do protect people that are, you know, kind of active people within the communities if their life became in danger, and they do monitor and report the violations, the stuff that is happening. We also have a women protection unit that protects women that have been, kind of, raped, or they've been in danger due to the situation on the ground. And, and it depends. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Depends on how the funding we have, depends on the partner we have. And I'm not saying in any way that we're here and very successful and doing it. I think we're not even close to, doing that part of the job, but I think we're trying to do what needs to be done with the resources that we have, limited as they are. We have learned through the years some good practices on just, farewelling information and making sure that we have redundancies in terms of the units that doing the work on the ground. But we had a lot of great conversations, promises of support in terms of capacity, promises of support in terms of funding. Some of them come through and some of them don't, but we're still pushing. I think being at the JIS Summit kind of opened our eyes more into so many different areas when it comes to like safety and security and duty of care. But again, we could only wish, could wish for a lot, but the practicality dictates that there's small areas that we have to focus on at the time being. This is what I have to say, and thank you for having me here. And I wish to. I'm looking forward to get my hand on that book. I don't have it yet.
Thanks, El Sanosi. I just wanted to jump in here and say thank you for your time. I know you're at an African Union event. Fine if you need to jump off now, but thanks very much for your perspective. Jochen, over to you.
Thank you so much, and grateful to be here today and to have been part of at least reviewing some chapters in the GPR8. But I would like to start with I guess one comment, and it was mentioned earlier, the change in dynamics and the operating environment, which is constantly evolving. I do think we're looking at a bit of a unique situation, and I know that everybody keeps on saying that all the time, especially about the countries they're working in. However, with the funding cuts we have recently experienced, and a significant increase in the selective application and disregard of international humanitarian law, the very framework which provides the logic for our ability to reach people, but also to protect us and our colleagues, is being eroded to an extent which I don't think we have witnessed before. And so that, of course, has huge implications on our ability, frameworks, and strategies, and how to ensure continuing of operations while ensuring that our colleagues and the people we serve are safe. So maybe just to get that off my chest before I briefly jump into the access chapter, and also just to say, I think it's great that we're having this conversation and including access in this conversation, since the multi-dimensional function or multi-sectoral function of access covers a lot of like security and risk management engagement, which has been discussed maybe too often separately, but more to that in a bit. First of all, maybe briefly to the overall definition of humanitarian access, and I'm aware that most of you are very familiar with that. Nevertheless, I still want to make a couple of comments on that. So when we talk about access, we talk about a dual dimension of humanitarian access. This is, first of all, our ability to reach people in need, but also people's ability to reach us. And when we speak about humanitarian access at an operational level, we mainly talk about trucks going from A to B and reaching people. We way too often ignore the fact that part of what we should be doing when we talk about access is also supporting, facilitating, and ensuring the safety of people trying to reach our services. So, and that brings me back to what I said at the very beginning, the foundations of which allows us, facilitates us, facilitates our operations, is based on like the humanitarian principles, which are stemming from General Assembly resolutions and the international normative frameworks. The framework we mostly rely on and define where the obligations of parties to the conflict are defined, the international humanitarian law or law of armed conflicts, is what we're currently looking at an erosion across the sector, in addition to the sector resetting and restructuring itself as well. So if we look at the categories of humanitarian access, and then also like how does this overlap and intersect with other parts of like the humanitarian program cycle, including security. So the way it's usually being divided up is in several categories, which are then based on like a number of incidents. So usually most access functions across the board use OHA's access monitoring reporting framework. In NRC, we have adjusted it slightly and categorized these 9 indicators into 2 dimensions, which is our ability to reach people and people's ability to reach us. And these 3 types of categories of impediments would be bureaucratic and administrative impediments. So that's your project approvals, that's your movement permits, that's your visa processes. So any bureaucratic processes which blocks, hinders, delays our ability to move and operate and implement, and they can be intentional or non-intentional. Then the second category which we look at is conflict, and so that's where we have by far the biggest overlap with security, and I think that's where we need to work much closer together. That looks at general violence, it looks at hostilities, but also at security threats and violence against humanitarian personnel, facilities and assets, but also landmines and IEDs, ERWs and so forth fall under that category. And then lastly, logistics and climate, a very unpopular category, which we tend to ignore a lot, but which has huge implications in our ability to reach people. And even a bigger, there's even a bigger constraint on people's ability to reach us, which is, for example, your rainy seasons, flooded roads, any kind of like climate shocks, infrastructure barriers, your broken bridges, and other obstacles. And of course, with climate change, we see an increase in this development. So the key points here I would like to mention is that the access impediments are cross-cutting, and the collection of the data in order for us to understand the operational environment and subsequently our ability to address these issues require a cross-departmental approach. And so we've seen that internally as well. A lot of the bureaucratic impediments, for example, wouldn't be picked up by the access staff or the security staff. They're picked up by the HR staff or by the admin staff, right? And then some access issues are security related, but others not necessarily, but might have implications. So what we have seen in our annual assessment is that while bureaucratic and administrative impediments is the biggest contributor to humanitarian impediments, we see that there is a close relationship between bureaucratic impediments and conflict. So the higher the level of conflict, usually the harder level of bureaucratic and administrative impediments, and both need to be addressed in order to ensure our ability to respond in a principled and safe manner. Then just briefly mentioning a couple of tools and one line, which I like to say when we talk about humanitarian access, is that we're actually looking at whatever we need to do from the checkpoint to the Security Council in order to facilitate the ability to reach people who need our support, but also, as mentioned earlier, the other way around. And some of the tools which are being used to address these key impediments is, first of all, analysis. So that's what we base our frameworks on. And an example here is, for example, access severity assessments. We define access severity levels similar to risk levels, which then in turn defines operational modalities. Access snapshots, I think these are most familiar to colleagues on the call. Then engagement, I use the word engagement because a lot of it falls under it. That's community outreach, acceptance, negotiations, civil military coordination, advocacy, and humanitarian diplomacy. And then the coordination piece to bring it all together, because what happens a lot is that we work on our own negotiations, but then the NGO next door just agreed to something very different with the same actor, which sets us back and creates an operational environment which is potentially even more constrained than it was before. And so the key here is as well the sequencing of these different tools and the levels of engagement, so to ensure that we're addressing the stakeholders who are impeding our ability to operate and are supposed to ensure our safety at the right level at the right time. And then, so I would like to close with something which is very dear to my heart, is humanitarian access, but also security, I believe, has been operating, I think, in a silo for far too long. And so what we will need to look at as a larger access and security community is to integrate humanitarian access much more holistically into our annual planning cycles, and not just view it as a reactive function, but also like a proactive function, which is looking at defining operational modalities from the get-go rather than responding to issues when we face them. The same should be mirrored at interagency levels, where humanitarian access considerations are usually not systematically integrated into planning and response cycles. And so then my final thoughts on this here is that we have seen an increase in access and security functions being merged, and there are several models on how this is being done, separated at HQ level, merged at field level. You have separate functions as well, or you have it slightly more integrated or double-headed by other functions. And so, again, the key here will be holistic integration of risk management and access into program cycle. Then, especially with the reset and the reduction in resources, we will need to look at maintain the functionality of access at field level. And we need to focus much more on program criticality to ensure that we accept risk levels based on the importance of the programming, and especially moving forward when we have a much more prioritized targeting of people we are able to serve with limited resources, which are more and more likely to be in areas which we would consider hard to reach. And so that has implications on how we operate in order to reach these people. I'll leave it at that and hand back over to Abby. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much, Joachim. We really appreciate that. Thank you to all the presenters and contributors, and a special thank you to Abby and Adelicia as the main authors and editors. They spent countless hours over the last 3 years to make this a reality. So now the moment everyone has been waiting for. The English PDF version of the book is available now from the HPN website, and the link is in the chat. In the coming months, you will also be able to download this PDF in French and Spanish. If you'd like to be the first to know when this comes out, you can also join our mailing list, which is also in the chat, and we'll be announcing those as the translations are ready. Unfortunately, due to funding limitations, a print run of hard copies was not done at this time, but we are collecting interest on those who would like a physical copy at the cost of printing and shipping, so that we can explore options based on number of people who would like one. There is a Google form link in the chat, and if you would like a physical copy, we invite you to fill this form out. Please copy and paste it, share it with your communities if anyone would like a physical copy. And then as we get more information, we will contact everyone that filled out this form. Another really exciting thing that we're pleased to share today is this edition of the GPR8 has its own interactive microsite. Right now, this is available in English, again, from the HPN website. The link is also in the chat. But in the coming months, this entire site will be available in French, Spanish, and Arabic. Through this microsite, you will see summaries of all 26 chapters, and you'll be able to navigate through the contents in an easy format on a computer or on a mobile phone. From this microsite, you can also download individual chapter PDFs if you don't want the PDF of the entire book. So again, if you're interested in the other languages, please join our mailing list or watch out for our social media channels, and we'll be announcing these things as they become available. So great that we got through so many exciting presentations today. Now we've got about 10 minutes left for our Q&A. So now's your chance to enter any questions, comments that you'd like to pose either to the editors, the authors, or any of the presenters that we had today. To get things started off, I've got a question for the staff care panel. So whichever one of you would like to take this. If you could expand on the benefits of the team-based support approach and how organizations with limited resources can utilize this, I think that would be interesting. One of you want to take that question? Lisa, you're first with your hand up. Thanks.
Thank you. I think it's based on the idea I was talking about community, and by strengthening that sense of team within organizations, that you're not facing some of these issues on your own, but that your managers care, that your peers care. And Marike and Steve both spoke about the importance of peer support. And it doesn't cost a lot of money. It is about a cultural change. When you say to somebody in the morning, "How are you?" actually meaning it and taking that opportunity to care about who you're working with. So this is what we want to expand. It's not something that costs a lot of money to do. It's about looking at changing attitudes and strengthening this sense of not being alone, which builds both resilience before an event and also your ability to recover once something's happened if you're involved in an incident. Does that give you an answer, MJ?
Yes, yeah, that does. That's helpful. Thank you. Did Steve and Ruki want to add anything to that? Steve?
Yeah, from my side, like any physical or mental health first aid course, of course you want to take it and take that information to help yourself, but of course you use it on your peers. The same thing with staff care elements. I think helping navigate your peers through incidents with the frustration and anger and disappointment and trauma fog removed, it's an obvious capacity to build that likely doesn't cost much. So yeah, I'm very, very interested in that part. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, guys. There's one question that I'm going to pose to Abby, and maybe you can expand on some of the other people that contributed to this edition. The question is, was there collaboration with UNDSS or SLT in relation to this edition? And maybe you could talk about some of the other organizations that contributed.
So before we embarked on the work of the revision, we undertook, as you've heard, a major research project together with GISF, where we did a whole raft of global interviews and also went to 5 different humanitarian settings to interview practitioners in the field. UNDSS was part of every one of those series of interviews. So we did speak to many UNDSS folks, including the Office of the Undersecretary General. And I believe there were many contributors who had experience with UNDSS, but I think that was the extent of it. I think it's fair to say this volume is more focused on NGOs than UN agencies, but we use the UN examples of their models throughout. I hope that answers the question.
Great, thank you, Abby. And I do see one question in the chat that I will answer. We're hoping to have French and Spanish translations of the PDF up in the next, I would say, 1 to 2, maximum 3 months. And the translations of the microsite will hopefully come perhaps by the end of August is our goal, but we're relying on some really great volunteers that have volunteered their time to help us translate the microsite and enter that content. So, you know, it will depend on their time, but we hope, you know, by the end of the summer or end of September. Anyone else have any questions, comments? I have a question that I could pose to the access panel. So if anyone wants to volunteer, in the chapter, it discusses external and internal impediments to access, which can be more challenging to prepare or train staff for.
That's a really good question. I think Jochen would probably be best to answer this. I think the access training that should be a part of security risk management can really serve to be able to address both. But Jochen, I'll let you answer.
Yeah, and that's the one question I didn't want to get because that's the most. That's the trickiest one. You're right. We're always talking about the external access constraints, and that we've got frameworks and reporting mechanisms and everything for that. But we're not very good at looking like what keeps us internally actually from doing what we need to be doing. And I think that for me, the short answer to that is program criticality. And so aligning everything within an organization to ensure that the operational modalities allow us to operate in areas which are hard to reach. And we will need to do that more and more. And so that goes from like risk appetite to where like risk management will become like a huge part of that conversation, but also to like money being spent on hardware in some hard to reach areas in order to provide that support. And I think that's where we currently have the largest constraints is like internal policies, but also the lack of integration and ambition potentially of organizations to say we want to work in certain areas, and that's what we need as an organization in order to be able to do this. As I mentioned earlier, so we will need to be focusing on that much more, and so that will be more engagement within organizations, integration required in order to pull that off. And so that's the siloed approach, which we have been doing for so long, in my opinion, is not going to solve the internal pieces, but only as an integrated, holistic organizational approach with the overall objective to work in certain areas. We'll address that. And then subsequently, any of the internal issues related to like risk appetite, related to financial resources on hardware required in certain areas, but will fall in line with that, hopefully.
Great, thanks, Jochen. I have another question probably for Abby on whether or not any Latin NGOs were consulted, either maybe for the state of practice review that contributed to this or the GPR8.
Yes, unfortunately, there wasn't a country visit in Latin America, but we had several countries represented in our global level interviews and research. And we are very lucky to have a colleague who is based in Medellin and is sort of establishing and expanding our networks there with security risk managers.
Great, thanks, Abby. Yes, Mariana, our colleague that you've seen putting all the great information in the chat is based in Colombia, and she's been a really integral member of the team for the State of Practice report and this GPR8 as well. For another one for the Access panel from Kenneth, is there any recommended neutral language to be used when doing security reporting in conflict areas?
I'll toss that to Eleanor just to say that I think it would be case by case.
Yeah, I think, I suppose, getting used to not referring to either side and removing that type of language when you're discussing anything is really important. And I think we've all seen that depending on what kind of what kind of case you're dealing with or where you are, you really need to be careful as to how you communicate with others across your team and outside your team about what's going on. So it's neutral and it's work related as opposed to picking sides. I think that would be it.
That said, I think it is the job of global organizations like us to call a spade, and when there are specific known perpetrators of this violence, to just make it known, not for any political point scoring, but because this is what's happening, and we're sort of, I think, responsible for being truthful and I think diplomatic action will follow naming of bad actors. We've seen in 2024 that state actors are now the majority perpetrators of most incidents, and it's important to consider this and to know who's doing what.
Great, thanks everyone. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time, so I just quickly wanted to reiterate where everything is available. The English PDF is now available on HPN's website for download. The link to the interactive microsite of this edition is also available on that same page. And if you'd like a physical copy, please do take the time to fill out that Google form so we can figure out the best way to get the book to the people that have requested it. So thanks again for everyone joining us today. We really appreciate it. Thank you to all the presenters. I hope everybody has a great rest of your day. And like Petra said, a boring career. Thanks, everyone.